building that many people today refer to as the Abigail. This is approximately the site where the first building was, we believe. There's been some question about whether part of that first building was incorporated into this. I'm not quite sure, to be honest. From what I've read, this was designed by Edwin Bowd, who was a very well-known Lansing architect, did many buildings of significance, including the Ingham County Courthouse, among others. Now, the building, as I said in Rizzi, is called the Abigail in tribute to Abigail Rogers, who was one of the first women who put this all together. That Michigan Female College was actually funded in part by the Turner family of the Turner Dodge home. In fact, he actually named one of his daughters Abigail in tribute to her.
Excuse me.
Uh-huh.
From what I understand, and I didn't hear what you first said, but I'm under the belief that the foundation of that building is from the original building.
Okay, that would make sense.
Yeah, I think the wings were added on.
Right.
Well,
Well, the original building even was
the
built
back-
in sections.
the back, yeah.
There was one wing
well,
built first,
yeah, the back-
and
Right.
then they added on across time. Yes, sir.
There was a building which we called Elm Hall, and that was over here on the other side of the, what we call the fountain, but those planters over here.
Uh-huh.
And we lived in that as a dormitory, and it was shaped like a T, and it actually had these things that just slid down.
Oh, how fun.
Fire
escapes,
escapes,
yeah.
Yeah.
Fire escape. Now, is that in part of your?
No, that's not something I can that. And I'm going to be open and honest. I am not the expert on this. I have had a lot of fun researching it and talking to other people who were involved, both as staff and as students. But certainly, if any of you have other information about the school you want to share tonight, please feel free. Sometimes it's hard for us today as 21st century Americans to really understand how these schools came to be and why they were established at the time. And I'll be frank and say that they're very controversial. Some states still have schools of the blind and schools for the deaf. Some states do not. It really depends state to state as to what the belief is, what the educational philosophy is that's invoked, as to what's offered for student services. The Victorians, though, were very interested in institutions of this sort, and that was a part of their culture. The Victorian era in America, particularly the post-Civil War Gilded Age, was a time when America was growing and states like Michigan were really coming into its own. And as a part of that, the Victorians believed very strongly that society should be advancing. I don't think it's a coincidence that this is a time when the theory of evolution starts to become talked about. There's the idea that we can change ourselves, we can improve ourselves. The Victorians were taught this in school. The idea was that we are not static. We should always be evolving and changing. And part of that change as a society was providing opportunities for all different types of people. The Victorians were also really the first to have the financial resources to be able to do this in places like Michigan. So in the 1850s, both the School for the Deaf and the School for the Blind were established, initially in Flint, and then the School for the Blind came here. And initially, everything was in that first building. You had dormitories, you had classrooms, you had staff that lived on site. Now, over the years, as things changed, you did have house parents who would stay here at night in the different cottages or dorms with the students, but the only people who actually lived on campus were the superintendent and his family. That was not true early on. Early on, a lot of the original instructors would have actually lived in the dorms with their charges. And a lot of the students who were coming in really found a sense of community here. Remember that Michigan is very rural at this point in time, and to be a child who was born blind or born with visual impairments, there's a good chance that your parents might not be able to provide you with the situation best for you. There's an even better chance that the local school teacher probably would have no idea as to help you learn, as to how to help you learn best. So these schools were established to bring the children together and to give them the opportunity to bond as a community and to have what's the word I'm looking for? To have access, there we go, to students, to teachers who had been specially trained to deal with their particular disabilities. And I can only imagine what it must have been like for these students at first. I've read different memoirs of people who went here even in the 1950s and 60s. And they talked about the fact that for many of them, this was the first time they had been in a community with people like themselves. And there was sort of this instant bond that existed. And I have to imagine that was so much more true even 70, 80 years before, when some of these students would have been coming from communities where they might have been the only visually impaired person that lived in that town. And keep in mind also, the student population here was largely not blind. It's called the School for the Blind, sort of a catch-all term, but there were many different sorts of disabilities. Some students were visually impaired, meaning that they had some visual ability, many of which would be considered legally blind. There were some students that had multiple disabilities. There were classes for blind and deaf students. There were classes for students who were blind and had learning disabilities as well. So there were a lot of different tracks, if you will, all within the one school. The idea, though, very much was to create some sort of sense of order out of the chaos. And that is very much a 19th century movement. The idea was that we live in a world that is chaotic, and we want to somehow be able to understand it. And the Victorians did this in different ways than we do today, of course, but part of that was they truly wanted to offer educational opportunities to all. You can go back and look at talks about literacy at the time, and people are talking about the fact that it should not just be the sighted population that has the chance to learn to read. Literacy was incredibly important to the Victorians, and this is a time when Braille is coming into fashion. And by coming to schools like this, the students had the opportunity to gain their own literacy through those programs. So I want you to think about that a little bit tonight as we continue on. The next building I want to talk about is the blonde brick school building over here. So let's head back that way.